A man stands on a rock and reads the law out loud. Cold wind off a lake, wet grass under boots, smoke from cooking fires drifting low. Voices carry across a wide, cracked valley like the place itself is built to broadcast a verdict. This shouldn't be possible, yet it's how the system works. A whole country runs its rules in the open, and still, nobody is the police. This is the balance sheet of civilizations, and this episode is about a strange kind of order, law without a state monopoly. You live downstream of this whether you know it or not. So let's touch the object. Picture a simple claim, not a speech, not a philosophy, a claim, a sentence that sounds like an invoice. He owes you compensation. No badge is coming, no squad car, no jail truck. If you want the money, or the justice, you have to collect. And that single fact changes everything. People think law is a thing you have, but law is a thing you enforce. People think rules are the hard part, but enforcement is the hard part. And in one place, for a long time, the enforcement was mostly private. Thingvellir, an open plain in Iceland, carved by stone and water, where the Alþingi gathered. An outdoor parliament that was also a court, and also a marketplace, and also a yearly audit of who could actually back up their words. People think the story is old democracy, but the real story is stranger. It's a society trying to keep itself together with law, while keeping the state thin. Here's the weird detail. They had courts, they issued verdicts, they could declare you guilty, and yet, there was no central authority whose job was to carry out the judgment, no executioner in the name of the state, no permanent enforcement arm sitting behind the law. So what did a verdict mean? It meant your name was spoken, your obligation was spoken, your liability was spoken, and then it became a social and financial problem that spread through everyone who knew you. People think the opposite of state power is no power, but the opposite of state power is often just power that's privatized, power that's personal, power that travels through families and alliances. Let's make the place real. Thingvellir was not a marble building. It was a summer city made of temporary booths, turf walls and stone edges, built for the session and then abandoned back to the weather. It smelled like wool, fish, smoke, and sweat. People didn't just come to vote on laws. They came to trade. They came to settle fights. They came to arrange marriages. They came to hear what the law was this year and to watch who could stand behind their claims. People think a parliament is a calendar item, but in a fragile society, a parliament is a pressure valve. It's where grudges either get priced or they spill into blood. Now, who runs this? At the center was a role that sounds almost comedic until you feel the weight of it. The law speaker. The job was to memorize the law and speak it out loud, over multiple summers, so the law stayed public, shared, and hard to fake. That's not a metaphor, that's the mechanism. If the rules aren't common knowledge, enforcement turns into pure muscle. If the rules are public, then even muscle has to answer to something the crowd recognizes. People think writing the law is what makes it real, but before paper was common, saying it, clearly, publicly, repeatedly, was how you kept the rules from being quietly rewritten by whoever was strongest that week. And it gets more structured than you'd expect. Over time, the Alþingi isn't just a shouting match. It develops a legal shape. Regional courts, a higher court for unresolved cases, judges, procedures, a whole machine of judgment. But again, the machine produces decisions. It does not automatically produce enforcement. So if the system doesn't have a standing enforcement arm, what does it run on? It runs on incentives. It runs on reputation. It runs on coalition. It runs on the fact that refusing to comply isn't just breaking a rule. It's announcing to everyone that deals with you are dangerous. People think this is a story about freedom, but it's also a story about risk management. Imagine you're a farmer. You live far from the assembly field. You're not rich. You don't have 20 men on horseback, but you still have a life. You still have property. You still have enemies. And you still have disputes, boundaries, injuries, theft, insults that turn into threats. You need a system that can turn violence into something else. You need to turn, "I will kill you," into, "You owe me." That is the heart of this kind of order, converting conflict into a claim that can be priced and collected. People think justice is mostly about punishing, but a lot of legal history is about converting damage into compensation, because compensation can be negotiated, transferred, and enforced through social leverage. Now we can name the machine. This is a society trying to run rule of law as a shared ledger without building a thick state. A ledger means something simple: credits and debits, obligations and payments, reputation as collateral. And once you see the ledger, you see why anarcho-capitalists love this place. Because if you want to believe the state is not necessary, you need a proof-of-life example. a community with courts and laws and order, where enforcement is not centrally monopolized. People think anarcho-capitalism is just edgy politics, but at its core, it's a bet about plumbing. Can private systems produce law, not just trade? Thingvellir is the historical exhibit they point to, but worked is a slippery word. The real question is, what did it cost? What did it reward? And what did it break when pressure got high? So let's break it down in plain terms. This design creates 3 consequences. 1. Verdicts start to look like invoices. A court decision is not the end. It's the beginning of collection. It tells you what you are owed, what you owe, and what you can demand. It's a public statement that puts a number, or at least a clear obligation, on an injury. That sounds clean, but it also changes behavior. If justice is a claim you have to collect, then people build their lives around collectability. Who has allies? Who is backed? Who can be pressured? Who will be protected if the other side escalates? People think equality comes from the law being written fairly. But in a world of private enforcement, equality depends on your ability to enforce what the law says you deserve. 2. Protection becomes a service, not just a right. In Iceland's Commonwealth era, local leaders, chieftains, matter because they function like organizers of support. If you have a dispute, you don't just have a case, you need a network. You need people who will stand with you at the assembly, and people who will stand with you afterward if collection turns ugly. And here's the part that makes economists lean forward. Those leadership positions could be treated like assets, shared, traded, inherited, sometimes effectively bought. Not in a clean modern stock market way, in a human way, through alliances, wealth, and bargaining. People think political power is always tied to land boundaries, but in this system, power is tied to relationships. If followers can choose which leader to back, leaders compete by offering better protection, better dispute support, better deals. That sounds like a market, and in some ways, it is. 3. Feud never fully disappears. It gets managed. If there's no central arm to enforce the law, the shadow behind every verdict is, will you comply voluntarily, or will we fight? The law can lower the temperature, it can create a shared script for settlement, but it can't delete the fact that someone might refuse. And if refusal becomes common, the system slides toward feud. People think the absence of a king means peace, but peace usually requires a credible threat against the people who won't settle. If the threat isn't centralized, it gets improvised. That's the trade. A thin state means low overhead. It also means enforcement is uneven, and the strong can sometimes turn private enforcement into private domination. Now we bring it back to the place. Thingvellir is where this gets priced in public. It's where the law speaker speaks the rules. It's where courts hear cases. It's where judgments get announced. And it's where everyone watches the same thing. Who shows up alone, and who shows up backed. People think laws are ideas, but laws are social events. The law is not just the rule, it's the crowd agreeing, yes, that's the rule, and then remembering who ignored it. You can almost see the workflow. A dispute rises in a district. It doesn't resolve. It gets pushed up to the National Assembly. The argument is heard, a decision is made, a judgment is pronounced, and then the real work starts. You go home and you collect, or you can't collect, or you collect only by escalating, or you settle for less, or you recruit allies, or you pay a leader to help you enforce, or you negotiate, or you wait until next summer to get the public signal you need. That's not romance, that's operations. People think a court win ends the story, but in private enforcement systems, a court win is like getting a piece of paper that says you're right, and then realizing right doesn't move goods unless someone makes it move. Now for the brutal math. 14 days. That's how long the country's main legal and political machine gathered in one place each year. That's why people treated attendance like survival, because if you lost the room, you could lose the year. So what did they do with those days? They didn't just pass rules, they solved coordination problems. And one of the cleanest examples is religion. At one point, Iceland was split. 2 groups, 2 law speakers, each side refusing to accept the other's rules. That's what real civilizational danger looks like. Not a foreign invasion, but a rulebook fracture. People think societies fall when they get poor, but societies often fall when they can't agree on a single rulebook. So the assembly made a decision that pushed the country back into a single legal lane. It wasn't everyone wins, it was everyone stays inside one system. That's what the Alþingi was really for, keeping the ledger shared. Now this is where anarcho-capitalists tend to speak too fast. They point to Iceland and say, see, you can have law without a state. But a careful reading is harsher. The system didn't run on no power. It ran on power that was redistributed into social enforcement and private coalitions. People think the choice is either a state monopoly or chaos. But there's a third option: fragmented enforcement that still produces order, until it doesn't. So let's state the paradox clearly, one time, in plain words. How can you have law without police? Here's the resolution. You can, if law is treated like a public standard for settling disputes, and enforcement is treated like a private obligation that rides on reputation, coalitions, and the cost of being cast out. If you refuse to comply, you don't just break a rule. You tell everyone that your promises are junk, that you can't be trusted, that any deal with you needs protection, that doing business with you is expensive. And if the society is small enough, tight enough, and repeated enough, that reputational penalty becomes real. People think trust is a feeling, but trust is collateral. Now add the other piece: competitive protection. If people can choose which leader to align with, leaders have an incentive to maintain credibility. They need followers. They need allies. They need to be seen as reliable enforcers of settlement. If they become pure bullies, followers can drift away, at least in theory, at least when alternatives exist. So the system can produce order without a king. As long as social exit is possible, reputational damage is costly, and private enforcement doesn't spiral into permanent war. That's the resolution. It's not magic. It's not utopia. It's conditional stability. And now we have to be honest about the balance sheet. What were the assets? Low administrative overhead, no heavy bureaucracy to feed, dispute resolution anchored in public rules, a culture trained to think in terms of claims, compensation, and settlement instead of pure revenge, and a yearly assembly that doubled as a market, a place where information traveled, where reputations were updated, where alliances were negotiated, where the legal system stayed public. People think the market is separate from the state, but here, the market was inside the political assembly. Trade and law were sharing the same oxygen. Now, what were the liabilities? Enforcement inequality. If you're weak, your legal rights can become theoretical. If you're strong, you can turn private enforcement into a private tax. And power concentration. Over time, leadership positions tend to gather around wealth and strong networks. Even if the system starts with open access, it can drift toward a smaller number of powerful blocks. People think a free system stays free by default, but systems drift. Incentives don't stay balanced just because the original design was clever. Then comes the nastiest liability, the feud logic. In a private enforcement world, every unresolved dispute carries an embedded threat. Will this stay in the legal lane, or will it go outside the lane? And if enough actors start choosing outside the lane, the legal system becomes a stage where people perform legitimacy while preparing for violence. That's when the ledger stops working. You can imagine what it looks like when the machine strains. A man is found liable. He refuses to pay. The injured party tries to collect. The defendant's allies block it. The injured party gathers support. The story spreads. Someone gets cornered. Someone swings first. Now it's not a case, it's a feud. People think the law fails suddenly, but it often fails when enforcement becomes too expensive. When it costs too much to make a verdict real, people stop using verdicts as their main tool, and then they start using other tools. This is how you get the ending. After generations, Iceland's Commonwealth period doesn't end because people forgot freedom. It ends because the system's internal enforcement pressures become harder to contain, especially when power concentrates and conflicts scale. Eventually, Iceland accepts external authority, submitting to a king, because a monopoly on enforcement can look like relief when private enforcement turns into permanent instability. People think states appear because someone wanted control, but states also appear because societies want a credible, final stop against endless settlement failure. That's the dark truth anarcho-capitalists have to stare at. The state is not only a predator, it's also a product of people wanting disputes to end. Now keep this evergreen. Bring it to your life in a simple way without romance. You already live with private enforcement systems. Think about arbitration clauses. Think about private security. Think about reputation systems that decide who gets access, who can rent, who can borrow, who can transact. Think about platforms with rules that are enforced not by police but by access. You're in or you're out. People think those things are just customer service, but they're often miniature legal systems. Rules, procedures, penalties, appeals, enforcement through exclusion. The old question from Thingvellir still applies. Who enforces, and what happens when they refuse? And here's the viewer lens to carry with you. Next time you hear someone argue about more government or less government, don't get hypnotized by the slogan. Listen for the enforcement path. Ask yourself in plain terms, when a rule is broken, who pays, who collects, who has the muscle, and what's the penalty for ignoring the verdict? If you can't trace the path from rule to consequence, you're not looking at a system, you're looking at a wish. So what's the lesson from Thingvellir? People think freedom is the absence of rules, but freedom is the presence of rules you can rely on. People think the opposite of the state is peace, but the opposite of the state is often negotiation, backed by private power. And people think law is a book, but in the real world, law is a ledger plus enforcement. Thingvellir shows you the beauty and the brutality of that truth. A society can run with a thin state for a long time, if trust stays expensive to break, and if the enforcement burden doesn't tilt too hard toward the strong. When it tilts, the ledger stops clearing. That's the balance sheet. Subscribe to the balance sheet of civilizations.